All right, so we're going to pick up here with part three, looking at our dermis. And so we just talked about in part two, we talked about the epidermis. We talked about the different layers of the epidermis and some of the different features that you can find associated with each of those layers, different types of cells, different number of layers, things like that. Now, our dermis is going to be just beneath this epidermis, and it will be categorized, and we'll break it up into two more layers. Okay, these different layers will be called the papillary layer and the reticular layer, and they'll be made up of different types of connective tissue that provide it with different characteristics. In general, beneath our epidermis, in this dermis, we have a somewhat of an ability to stretch, some elasticity to be able to return to our normal shape. And the reason we have this is because of our different fibers here. We have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, reticular fibers. We also have some immune cells, so macrophages here as well. And again, like I said, we have a papillary layer and a reticular layer. Our papillary layer will contain primarily loose or areolar connective tissue, whereas our reticular layer will contain dense, irregular connective tissue. It's in this papillary layer that we'll see terms like epidermal ridge and dermal papillae, and our reticular layer is going to take up the vast majority of our dermis. So when we look at a picture here, you can see this small layer right up here where my cursor is. All of this straight across here is going to be papillary layer, and then our reticular layer is the vast majority. So roughly 80% of our dermis is going to be categorized as reticular. And we'll see lots of blood vessels, we'll see lots of nerves, lots of accessory organs and structures associated with our reticular layer. Now, over here, associated with our papillary layer, we see our terms epidermal ridge and dermal papillae. And now what these are features of either the epidermis or the dermis that contribute to this kind of convoluted pattern that you see here. And it's this pattern in the distal regions of our digits, so our fingers and toes, that we find our fingerprints. And so what you have is this region of epidermis that kind of invaginates down. That is the epidermal ridge, and then we have this kind of corresponding region of dermis that protrudes up. And it's this relationship between epidermal ridge and dermal papillae sticking up that provide us with this with these different grooves that we recognize as fingerprints. And so fingerprints have been used for identification in crimes and forensics for a long time. And you can look at your own fingers. If you look at your one of your hands, you can look at the tips of your fingers, and you'll see different patterns of fingerprints. So there are ones that are called loops. There are whorls, swirls. There are ones that are kind of tinted in appearance, and these different patterns and arrangements can have serious implications for forensic science in the identification of suspects for crimes and other similar things like that. And so here we can see a picture of a histological picture of our dermis. So you can see way down here our reticular layer, and then way up here our papillary layer. Here you can see an epidermal ridge, and here you can see a dermal papillae. And again, remember, this reticular layer, the majority of our dermis is going to be composed of dense, irregular connective tissue, and our papillary layer up here is primarily loose connective tissue. Within our reticular layer, this is where we have the majority of our nerves, our blood vessels, and other accessory organs. So if we go back here, you can see lots of blood vessels coursing throughout here. You can see lots of nerves, and you can see other accessory organs like oil glands, hair shaft, and these little muscles here that we'll talk about later. And so here's another example of our epidermal ridge and dermal papillae. So here's the epidermis, here's our dermis down here, and here's the interaction between the two. And it's these projections of dermal papillae and these kind of invaginations of an epidermal ridge that provide us with our fingerprints. Okay. And then our next layer that's not technically a layer of the skin is our hypodermis. Now sometimes this is called subcutaneous layer, sub meaning beneath or below, cutaneous meaning the skin, so this is the layer beneath the skin. And sometimes it's called our superficial fascia. We also have a deep fascia that is located obviously more deeply than this hypodermal layer. Like I said, not considered a part of the skin, layer of the skin, and it contains primarily fat tissue or adipose tissue. Now, you can term this superficial fascia cellulite whenever it has a kind of grainy or lumpy appearance to it. And so you can see that oftentimes on the back of legs and on the thigh region as well, kind of going down into the popliteal region as well. Um, and then there are cosmetic procedures, things like liposuction, in which the subcutaneous layer, the superficial fascia, all of this fat and adipose tissue can be evacuated and be sucked out via vacuum to reduce or to aid in this kind of cellulite appearance here. So here you can see it here, subcutaneous layer beneath our dermis. And again, remember, it is composed primarily of adipose tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue, and it is not a layer of our skin. So let's answer some questions, and then we'll stop here before we're moving on to the next part. So what does the epidermis contain blood vessels? You should recognize this as being, as the answer being no, it does not. We get into blood vessels once we get deeper into our dermal layer, primarily our reticular layer. What is the function of dendritic cells? Well, we know that dendritic cells, also called Langerhans cells, participate in our immune system and function as antigen-presenting cells. What additional skin layer is found in certain areas of the body? Well, this is this stratum lucidum. And what are these certain areas? Well, we know that our palms of our hands, soles of our feet, and our digits, so our the tips of our fingers and toes, will contain the stratum lucidum as this thicker layer, or thicker regions of skin. And then cells of what layer are constantly being shed? Well, if you think about from deep to superficial, our most superficial layer is going to be our stratum corneum. And so it is the stratum corneum where cells are constantly being shed, and it is replaced approximately every 4 weeks or so. And so use these questions. If you did not know these answers, go back through, continue reviewing, and we'll pick up with part 4 in our next